A Bronze Age superpower vanished without leaving a clear reason. The Hittite Empire, a rival to ancient Egypt with its own vast territories, and the first known peace treaty, collapsed so abruptly around 1200 BCE that it became little more than a legend for millennia. Its disappearance is one of history's greatest puzzles, forcing us to question how a mighty civilization can simply shatter. By the end of this journey, you will understand the competing theories behind this ancient mystery, from climate disasters to enigmatic invaders. We will sift through archaeological clues and decipher fragmented texts to uncover why, even after centuries of study, experts are still baffled by the Hittite fall. What does it take for an entire empire to be erased from memory? From a small kingdom in the rocky highlands of Anatolia, the Hittites forged an empire that would dominate the ancient world for centuries. Their ascent began around 1600 BCE, not through chance, but through a revolutionary technological breakthrough. They mastered the art of smelting iron, a metal far stronger and more durable than the bronze used by their rivals. This gave their soldiers a devastating advantage on the battlefield, equipping them with superior weapons that could shatter the arms of their enemies. Their power was centered at Hattusa, a capital city that was a marvel of its time. Imagine massive stone walls, towering gateways guarded by carved lions and sphinxes, and deep underground tunnels securing immense stockpiles of grain. Within its libraries, thousands of clay tablets recorded everything from laws and treaties to religious rituals, a testament to a highly organized and literate society. The empire reached its zenith under rulers like the formidable King Suppiluliuma I, a brilliant strategist who expanded Hittite territory deep into Syria, directly challenging the might of Egypt itself. This rivalry culminated not in endless war, but in a landmark achievement of diplomacy. After a stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites and Egyptians negotiated the first known international peace treaty, a document that survives on clay and stone, promising peace and mutual support between the two superpowers. This was a civilization of profound complexity with a pantheon of 1,000 gods, sophisticated legal codes that prescribed justice, and trade networks that stretched across the known world. They built a robust, interconnected society that seemed unshakable, which makes the silence that followed their collapse so profoundly deafening. How could a civilization so advanced, so deeply entrenched, simply vanish from the stage of history? The answer lies not in their strength, but in the perfect storm of crises that shattered it. The sheer scale of the Hittite collapse is matched only by the complexity of its causes. Scholars are like detectives at a massive crime scene, surrounded by scattered clues but lacking a clear confession. The debate is not about one single culprit, but a tangled web of possibilities. One prominent suspect is a shadowy coalition known only as the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian texts describe these mysterious maritime raiders attacking coasts and toppling kingdoms around the same time the Hittite cities fell. Could waves of invaders have overwhelmed their defenses and severed vital trade routes, cutting off the empire's economic lifeblood? Another compelling theory points to the environment. What if the earth itself turned against the Hittites? Evidence from tree rings and sediment cores suggests a period of catastrophic drought may have gripped the region. For an empire reliant on grain, years of failed harvests would have meant widespread famine, social unrest, and a kingdom too weak to defend itself. But perhaps the greatest threat came from within. A sprawling empire is always vulnerable to internal strife. Civil war between rival princes or rebellion by subordinate states could have fractured the Hittite realm, leaving it exposed to any external shock. Finally, some historians argue the empire was a victim of its own success. Its highly centralized government, which once provided great strength, may have become a fatal weakness. When a crisis hit, this rigid system might have been too inflexible to adapt, leading to a total systemic failure. Each of these theories has passionate advocates and convincing pieces of evidence, yet none provides a complete picture on its own. So how do we begin to sort through these competing narratives? The investigation starts by examining the first and most famous suspect, the enigmatic Sea Peoples. The name Sea Peoples sounds like something from an ancient legend, a phantom fleet emerging from the fog to topple civilizations. Egyptian inscriptions depict them as a relentless, destructive force, carving a path of chaos through the eastern Mediterranean around the very time the Hittite world was falling apart. These carvings show fierce battles on both land and sea, with the Egyptians proudly claiming victory over these enigmatic invaders. The theory is compellingly straightforward. If these raiders were plundering coastal cities and sinking merchant ships, they could have severed the Hittite Empire from its crucial supply lines. Tin for bronze, luxury goods for the elite, even food shipments, all of it could have been strangled. The empire, landlocked at its core, would have been starved and isolated. Some even suggest these marauders pushed inland, perhaps contributing to the burning of Hattusa itself. Yet for all the drama, a critical piece of evidence is missing. No Hittite tablet ever explicitly names the Sea Peoples as their destroyer. They are a ghost in the Egyptian records, absent from the Hittites' own final words. This forces a difficult question. Were the Sea Peoples the primary cause of the collapse, or were they merely scavengers, taking advantage of an empire that was already crumbling from within? Perhaps they were not even invaders in the traditional sense, but desperate masses of migrants and refugees, fleeing their own environmental disasters or political upheavals elsewhere. They may have been less a cause and more a symptom of a wider, regional catastrophe, a tidal wave of human desperation that simply overwhelmed a weakened Hittite state. The identity and true role of the Sea Peoples remains one of history's most tantalizing dead ends. But if they were not the sole architects of the fall, what other force could bring a Bronze Age superpower to its knees? While the identity of the Sea Peoples remains a ghost in the historical record, another suspect leaves behind much more concrete evidence, etched not in stone but in the very rings of ancient trees. Scientific data from tree rings and sediment cores paints a stark picture of a world in crisis. The climate of the late Bronze Age underwent a dramatic shift, plunging the eastern Mediterranean into a 300-year period of severe and unrelenting drought. For the Hittite Empire, this was not merely a seasonal inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Their entire society was built upon a foundation of grain, the agricultural surplus that fed its cities, paid its soldiers, and stored its power. Imagine the slow, creeping disaster of successive harvests failing. Grain silos that were once symbols of imperial strength would have slowly emptied. A famine lasting not 1 or 2 years but for decades would have unraveled the social fabric. Malnourished populations are prone to disease, and desperate people challenge authority. The empire's once loyal subjects might have risen in revolt against a central government that could no longer provide the most basic necessity, food. A weakened, hungry army, its soldiers more concerned with their family's survival than defending distant frontiers, would have been easy prey for any invader or rebel force. This environmental catastrophe offers a powerful explanation for the abandonment of Hattusa itself. Why would a people deliberately leave their magnificent, fortified capital? Perhaps because the land around it could no longer sustain them. the life-giving springs and farmlands that supported the great city may have dried up, forcing a mass exodus in search of water and fertile soil. This theory presents a humbling lesson. It suggests that the Hittite Empire, for all its military might and diplomatic brilliance, was ultimately brought low by forces it could not control. The real enemy may not have been a foreign army with iron weapons, but a silent, invisible shift in the weather. Yet, if a widespread drought was the primary cause, why did other civilizations in the region, like Egypt, manage to survive this turbulent period while the Hittites vanished completely? This question pushes us to look not just at external pressures, but at the internal cracks that may have already been forming within the empire's own structure. Even the mightiest fortress can be brought down by a crack in its own foundation. While drought and invaders loom large in the story of the Hittite fall, a more insidious threat may have been festering within the empire's own political heart. The Hittite state was not a monolithic block. It was a patchwork of territories held together by the sheer force of the king's will and the loyalty of often restless vassal rulers. This entire structure was dangerously vulnerable to a single event, the death of a powerful monarch. When a strong king died, the empire held its breath. The succession was not always clear, and rival princes, backed by different factions of the nobility, would frequently plunge the realm into civil war. Armies that should have been guarding the frontiers were instead turned inward, fighting their own kin for the right to rule. Resources were squandered, and the central government's attention was diverted from managing crises like famine or invasion. At the same time, those semi-independent vassal states on the empire's edges saw their opportunity. A king distracted by civil war was a weak king. Why continue sending tribute and troops to a distant capital embroiled in its own conflicts? One by one, these provinces could have declared their independence, peeling away the empire's outer layers and shrinking its power base. Fragmented tablets from the final years do speak of unrest and communications that grow increasingly desperate, but the full story is lost. This internal rot theory presents a chilling possibility. The Hittite Empire may not have been shattered by a single hammer blow from outside, but may have instead collapsed under the weight of its own political rivalries. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, and a kingdom that is both divided and starving faces an even more dire predicament. The empire's treasury was not filled with gold, but with grain and tin. A Hittite king's true power was measured by his control over trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age. Their economy depended on a delicate, long-distance ballet. Tin from distant Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus were shipped across the Mediterranean, combined to forge the bronze that armed their soldiers and tools. At the same time, the agricultural surplus from Anatolia's heartland fed the cities and filled the state granaries. This entire system was a house of cards. A single push could bring it all down. If the sea peoples were raiding merchant ships and blockading ports, that vital flow of metals would simply stop. Bronze production would halt, leaving the empire unable to equip new armies or repair its tools. Simultaneously, the prolonged droughts would have devastated the grain supply. Imagine the economic chaos that would follow. With less food and fewer goods, prices would have skyrocketed. A family's savings might suddenly be worthless, unable to buy a single bag of grain. This is the grim reality of hyperinflation in an ancient world. Archaeological evidence confirms this catastrophic breakdown. Shipwrecks from this period, like the one found at Uluburan off the coast of Turkey, show a dramatic decline in the volume and range of luxury goods and raw materials being transported. The great economic web that connected empires was fraying, and then it snapped. A state cannot function without an economy. Without metals, the army disintegrates. Without food, the population starves or rebels. and without trade, the tax revenue that supported the entire bureaucracy, from scribes to governors, evaporates. The Hittite Empire was caught in a perfect economic storm, a downward spiral from which recovery was impossible. This reveals a profound vulnerability that echoes through the centuries. How much does any complex society truly depend on the thin, fragile threads of its supply chains? A sprawling empire can starve not from a lack of food, but from a hollowing out of its very substance. The Hittites had built their world on resources that were not infinite. For centuries, the great forests of Anatolia were felled to build their cities, fuel their forges, and heat their homes. This relentless deforestation had a hidden cost. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, the fertile topsoil would have washed away with the rains, diminishing the land's ability to grow the very grain the empire depended on. They were literally eroding the foundation of their own agriculture. At the same time, the rich mines that supplied their essential copper and the tin for their bronze weapons were not bottomless. After generations of intensive mining, the most accessible veins were likely exhausted. Digging deeper and farther for smaller returns becomes a massive drain on any economy, straining the state's finances for diminishing gains. This resource depletion created a terrible paradox. To secure new sources of timber and metal, the empire had to expand, but expansion itself demanded even more resources. It was a vicious cycle of consumption that could not be sustained forever. Maintaining this far-flung territory became a crushing burden. The empire required a constant state of military readiness, with expensive garrisons stationed from the Aegean coast to northern Syria. Every campaign to put down a rebellion or secure a distant border drained the royal treasury and stretched the pool of available soldiers dangerously thin. The very army that had built the empire was now stretched across it, leaving the core territories, the heartland around Hattusa, potentially vulnerable. When the droughts began and the sea peoples emerged, the empire's defenses were not concentrated at a single point of failure. They were scattered across a vast landscape, unable to respond effectively to a simultaneous crisis. This is the ultimate risk of imperial overreach. A system becomes so large and so complex that it loses its resilience. The Hittites' greatness depended on a constant, uninterrupted flow of resources, and when that flow was threatened by environmental change and external disruption, the entire intricate structure began to falter. But what if, in its final days, the empire was fighting an enemy even more invisible than drought, an enemy that attacked not its fields or its forts, but the health of its very people? A final, invisible enemy may have been stalking the Hittites, one that left no monuments and required no armies. While written proof is rare, the specter of pandemic disease haunts the final days of many Bronze Age civilizations. Texts from neighboring lands like Egypt speak of plagues sweeping through populations, and the skeletal remains found in some Hittite settlements show clear markers of chronic malnutrition and physical stress, conditions that make a population tragically vulnerable to infection. Imagine a deadly virus or a relentless bacterial illness, perhaps carried along the very trade routes that once brought the empire its wealth, finding a perfect breeding ground in a people already weakened by hunger. The consequences would have been catastrophic. A disease ravaging the farming villages would have crippled the agricultural labor force, ensuring that even if the rains returned, there would be no one to till the fields or bring in the harvest. An epidemic striking the army camps would have decimated the ranks of soldiers, leaving frontiers undefended not by choice but by grim necessity. The societal fabric would have frayed under the weight of such a crisis. Fear of contagion can shatter community bonds as people turn on each other or abandon the sick. The central government, already struggling with famine and rebellion, would have found its tax base evaporated and its authority meaningless in the face of a terror it could not fight. A single virulent outbreak in the densely populated capital of Hattusa could have been the final, devastating blow, emptying the city as much as any drought or invasion. This biological factor is a chilling reminder that history's greatest upheavals can be driven by microscopic forces, invisible enemies that leave only indirect clues in their wake. To find more direct evidence of the empire's final moments, we must turn to the silent testimony of the stones themselves, to the ashes of Hattusa. The ruins of Hattusa tell a story of quiet departure, not fiery destruction. Archaeologists digging through the layers of time found a capital city that was meticulously emptied, not brutally ransacked. Palaces and temples stood with their walls largely intact, their doors left open to the elements. The truly revealing clue is what is missing: gold, ceremonial artifacts, and other precious objects that would be the first things looters target were gone. This was no surprise attack, it was a planned and likely painful exodus. The people who left took their most valued possessions with them, suggesting they intended to return or at least to begin anew somewhere else. Even the vast royal archives, thousands of clay tablets containing the empire's laws, treaties, and history, were carefully stored in sealed rooms, as if waiting for scribes who would never come back to unroll them. This act of preservation in the face of abandonment is profoundly telling. It speaks of a people clinging to their identity even as they were forced to forsake their home. The city's formidable defensive walls add another layer to the mystery. They show clear signs of repeated repairs and reinforcements, evidence that the Hittites were fighting off threats for years, perhaps decades. They were preparing for a siege that, in the end, never came. The final enemy was not an army at the gates, but a creeping, relentless pressure that made the great capital unsustainable. This evidence from Hattusa directly challenges the idea of a single, catastrophic invasion. It paints a far more haunting picture of a slow, burning crisis, a systemic failure where the lights were turned off one by one. The population did not flee in a single day, but likely dwindled over seasons or years as famine, economic collapse, or disease made urban life impossible. They simply walked away from their magnificent city, scattering into the highlands of Anatolia to seek mere survival. But was Hattusa an isolated case, or was this pattern of quiet abandonment repeated across the empire? The silence that fell over Hattusa was not an isolated event, but a single note in a symphony of collapse. Around 1200 BC, the entire eastern Mediterranean world seemed to shatter. The magnificent palace complexes of the Mycenaeans in Greece were burned and abandoned. In Mesopotamia, great cities shrank or were left empty. Even Egypt, though it survived, saw its power and influence wane dramatically, retreating behind its borders. Historians call this widespread catastrophe the Bronze Age collapse, a systemic failure that toppled empires and erased centuries of cultural progress in a remarkably short time. This was not a series of isolated tragedies, but a domino effect. The disintegration of one civilization placed immense strain on the next, as vital trade routes snapped and alliances crumbled. Imagine a vast, interconnected network where each node supports the others. When one node, like the Hittite Empire, goes dark, the entire system begins to flicker and fail. This broader perspective forces us to reconsider the Hittite mystery. Their fall was not a unique, self-contained drama, but a central act in a much larger regional tragedy. The same suspects appear everywhere. Evidence of severe drought is found from Greece to the Levant. Inscriptions from multiple lands speak of mysterious raiders and mass migrations, the elusive sea peoples. Internal rebellions and palace uprisings are recorded in the final days of the Mycenaean kingdoms as well. This pattern suggests powerful, universal triggers were at work. Yet the outcomes were not identical. Egypt endured though weakened. Why? It had the Nile, a predictable and resilient source of water and fertility that buffered it against the worst of the droughts. The Hittite heartland, by contrast, was entirely dependent on rainfall, a far more fragile agricultural system. The Mycenaeans, with their decentralized, palace-centered economies, may have lacked the central authority to organize a unified defense or recovery. This comparative view reveals a crucial truth. The Hittites were not necessarily more fragile than their neighbors. Instead, they possessed a specific combination of vulnerabilities. Their landlocked, rain-fed capital, their absolute dependence on long-distance trade for essential metals, and their politically volatile succession system created a perfect recipe for disaster when the entire regional system went into shock. Their collapse appears so absolute because every one of their weaknesses was exploited simultaneously by this perfect storm. This raises a profound question about the echoes of this ancient disaster. What happens to the people, the language, and the memory of a civilization when its political structure is utterly erased? The political collapse was followed by a cultural vanishing act. Across the Anatolian plateau, the distinct identity of the Hittite Empire dissolved with startling speed. The great imperial centers were not just abandoned, they were forgotten. The intricate cuneiform script, used for centuries to record laws, treaties, and royal decrees, was simply set down. No new generations of scribes were trained to read or write it. The Hittite language itself, an Indo-European tongue that had echoed through the halls of Hattusa, fell silent, becoming a dead language almost overnight. In the smaller kingdoms that survived in Syria, like Carchemish, a cultural shift occurred. The old imperial Hittite traditions were replaced. Local rulers began using a different script, known as Luwian hieroglyphs, and their art and public inscriptions celebrated a new, regional identity, consciously stepping out of the shadow of the fallen empire. This was not a gradual evolution, but a deliberate break. The institutions that had safeguarded Hittite memory for generations, the temple schools and the royal scribal offices, ceased to function. When the social order that supports culture shatters, the knowledge it carries can be lost in a single lifetime. For 3,000 years, the Hittites existed only as a faint echo in the Bible and a handful of Egyptian records, a ghost of a forgotten superpower. Their rediscovery was a modern miracle of decipherment, piecing together a lost language from clay tablets that no one had understood for millennia. This profound cultural amnesia is a central part of the mystery. It suggests the collapse was so total that it broke the chain of memory itself. How does an entire people forget who they were? This question pushes us to look at the final pieces of the puzzle, the movements of people that may have scattered the last Hittites to the winds. When the great cities were emptied, the people did not simply vanish from the earth. The human tide of the Hittite world was forced to move, leaving the highlands of Anatolia for the coasts or pushing south into Syria. These were not journeys of conquest, but migrations of desperation. Driven by years of crop failure and the breakdown of order, communities fractured and sought refuge wherever survival seemed possible. Archaeological layers reveal this exodus in the sudden abandonment of inland villages and the corresponding rapid growth of settlements along the Mediterranean shoreline. In the south, at places like Carchemish, a remarkable transformation occurred. This city became a new center, a Neo-Hittite state where the old imperial language and artistic styles persisted, but in a changed, more localized form. The rulers of Carchemish still called themselves kings, and their public monuments featured the same gods and hieroglyphic script, yet the grand, imperial vision of Hattusa was gone. This was a faded copy of a lost original, a testament to a culture trying to cling to its identity even as its political heart had stopped beating. The direction of this human flow remains a subject of fierce debate. Were these mass movements a primary cause of the collapse, with waves of displaced people overwhelming the empire's infrastructure? Or were they merely the final, tragic effect, the scattering of a population that had already lost everything? Some historians propose that incoming groups from the Balkans or the Aegean may have entered Anatolia, not as a unified invading army, but as a slow infiltration of new peoples who eventually assimilated with or displaced the remaining Hittite communities. This blending and replacement would have further obscured the Hittite lineage, dissolving their distinct cultural signature into the wider population of the ancient Near East. Tracing these migrations is like trying to follow a river that has long since dried up. We see the channels it carved, but the water itself is gone. This human dimension reminds us that the collapse of an empire is not just about fallen palaces and silent archives. It is about countless individual stories of loss, resilience, and the difficult choice to leave a homeland behind. It shows us how people adapt, carrying fragments of their culture with them as they seek a new beginning. This scattering of the Hittite people left their former homeland vulnerable, a power vacuum that would inevitably be filled. But what role did the empire's legendary military, the very instrument of its rise, play in its final, desperate days? An empire's army is its shield, and when that shield cracks, everything behind it is exposed. The Hittite military was once the terror of the ancient world, a force built around a revolutionary chariot corps and weapons of hardened iron. But in its final decades, that shield appears to have shattered. Maintaining a professional army is phenomenally expensive, and a state grappling with famine and economic collapse would have found it nearly impossible to feed its soldiers, pay their wages, or replace their broken gear. The bronze for swords and spears depended on trade routes that were now severed, and the iron for their legendary superiority required vast amounts of charcoal from forests that were likely depleted. A soldier who has not eaten cannot fight, and a commander who cannot equip his troops cannot command their loyalty. This resource starvation would have crippled the military from within, long before any enemy appeared on the horizon. We see archaeological evidence of this decay in the ruined fortresses that once guarded the empire's frontiers. These strategic outposts show signs of violent destruction, their walls burned and breached. Yet, crucially, they were often not rebuilt. This suggests a central authority that no longer had the means or the will to project its power to the edges of its realm. The pattern of settlements also shifts dramatically, with populations abandoning vulnerable valleys and open plains to cluster on remote, easily defensible hilltops. This is not the behavior of a people living under a strong, protective state. It is the action of communities fending for themselves in a world descending into chaos. But who was delivering these blows? The mysterious sea peoples remain a prime suspect, but they were not the only threat. To the north, the semi-nomadic Kaskian tribes had been a persistent nuisance for centuries, raiding the Hittite heartland. With the imperial army stretched thin and weakened, these raids could have transformed into full-scale invasions, pouring into the undefended countryside. Internally, rival princes or rebellious vassal kings may have turned their own local militias against the crown, sparking civil wars that consumed the empire's remaining strength. The ultimate paradox is that Hattusa itself was not conquered by a clear victor. There was no triumphant foreign army that marched through its gates and raised its own standard. The city was simply left behind. This indicates that the Hittite military did not lose one decisive battle, but rather dissolved under the weight of countless pressures, its soldiers perhaps deserting to protect their own families. A security failure on this scale creates a vicious cycle. As the army weakens, rebellions become more frequent, which further drains the army, which invites more external attacks. The empire's authority, built on intimidation and control, evaporates when it can no longer enforce its will. This collapse of faith in the state's protective power may have eroded something even deeper than political loyalty. It may have shaken the people's belief in the divine order that the empire claimed to represent. When a king is also a god's chief priest, his failures are never just political. The Hittite state was bound together by a powerful state religion, a complex web of rituals and 1,000 gods, all presided over by the monarch. His sacred duty was to maintain divine favor, ensuring the rains would fall and the harvests would be plentiful. So what happened when the rains stopped year after year? The prolonged drought would not have been seen as a simple weather pattern, but as a terrifying sign of divine abandonment. The king, the empire's spiritual anchor, would have appeared to have lost the god's blessing. This created a profound crisis of legitimacy. Why should people obey a ruler who could no longer deliver the most fundamental proof of his divine mandate? Faith in the entire ruling structure would have crumbled as quickly as the parched earth. We have glimpses of this spiritual desperation in the clay tablets themselves. In the empire's final years, scribes recorded an increasing number of ominous signs and frantic rituals, desperate attempts to read the will of the angry gods and plead for their mercy. The very volume of these texts suggests a system under immense psychological strain, a priesthood and a populace losing confidence in the old ways. This ideological vacuum might have given rise to new cults or rebellious local religious movements that offered different answers, further fracturing the empire's cultural unity. While this spiritual collapse did not single-handedly destroy the empire, it severed a critical bond between the rulers and the ruled. A people who believe their leaders have lost the favor of the gods are far less likely to follow them into battle, pay their taxes, or endure famine on their behalf. This is the psychological dimension of collapse, a silent unraveling of the shared stories that hold a civilization together. The material world of grain and bronze had failed, and now the spiritual world was failing too. What remains of a society when both its body and its soul have been broken? This question leads us from the ashes of the empire to its surprising, fragmented legacy. The fall of the Hittite Empire was not a final curtain call, but a dramatic transformation. Though their political power dissolved, their ideas refused to die. One of their most profound contributions was in the realm of law. The Hittite legal codes, preserved on countless clay tablets, presented a vision of justice that was remarkably nuanced for its time. Unlike the harsher Babylonian laws of an eye for an eye, Hittite statutes often prescribed restitution instead of brutal retaliation. Theft might be punished with compensation paid to the victim, not automatic mutilation or death. This more measured approach to justice would echo through the centuries, influencing the legal traditions of later Mesopotamian empires and helping to shape the foundational concepts of law in the ancient world. Their technological legacy was equally revolutionary. The Hittites did not merely possess iron, they mastered its secret on an industrial scale. While other cultures struggled with the difficult smelting process, the Hittites turned it into a state-controlled art, producing weapons and tools of unparalleled strength. After the empire's fragmentation, this knowledge could no longer be contained. Blacksmiths and metalworkers, now without imperial patronage, likely dispersed across the region, taking their specialized skills with them. The secret of ironworking seeped out, first into Syria and the Levant, and then across the Mediterranean, effectively ending the Bronze Age and ushering in the new Iron Age. The very technology that had built their military supremacy became their ultimate gift to the world, a gift that reshaped human civilization forever. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the Hittite Empire lived on in a faded yet recognizable form. Across northern Syria and southern Anatolia, a network of small, independent city-states emerged. Scholars call them the Neo-Hittite states, centered in cities like Carchemish and Zincirli. These kingdoms were ruled by elites who still used the Luwian hieroglyphic script of their ancestors and erected massive stone gateways guarded by carved lions and sphinxes, directly echoing the grand art of Hattusa. But this was not a pure revival. These states existed at a cultural crossroads, constantly interacting with the rising power of the Assyrian Empire to the east and various Aramean tribes. Their art and architecture became a fascinating blend, mixing classic Hittite motifs with Assyrian stylistic influences and Aramean language. They were keeping a flame alive, even as it was slowly being absorbed into a new cultural fire. Perhaps their most concrete diplomatic achievement also survived. The peace treaty signed between Hattusili III and Ramses II of Egypt was not just a temporary truce. Carved into temple walls at Karnak and preserved on clay tablets in Hattusa, it established a blueprint for international relations. It outlined terms for mutual defense, the extradition of political refugees, and a lasting peace between two superpowers. This document set a powerful precedent, demonstrating that even the bitterest of rivals could choose negotiation over endless war. Its principles of reciprocity and sworn oaths would influence the diplomatic language of the Near East for generations to come. And then there are the archives themselves, the thousands of tablets left behind in the abandoned libraries of Hattusa provide a priceless, multilingual window into the ancient world. Written not only in Hittite but also in Akkadian, the international language of the day, and other ancient tongues like Luwian and Palaic, these texts do more than just tell the Hittite story. They allow historians to cross-reference events, compare religious practices, and understand the complex web of interactions between all the major powers of the Bronze Age. They are a time capsule of an entire era, preserved by the very collapse that sought to erase them. This enduring legacy presents a poignant paradox. The core of Hittite identity, their imperial language, their central religion, and their political unity was shattered beyond repair. Yet, like a fallen tree giving life to a new forest, their collapse scattered seeds that would nourish future civilizations. Their laws, their technology, their art, and their diplomacy were absorbed and adapted by others, becoming threads woven into the fabric of history. Understanding this legacy makes their disappearance feel not like an ending, but a metamorphosis. It also deepens the central mystery, pushing us to ask how we can truly know what happened to them. The search for answers now relies on tools the Hittites themselves could never have imagined. The silent stones of Hattusa are finally beginning to speak, their secrets unlocked not by shovels alone, but by the hum of orbiting satellites and the precision of laser light. Modern archaeology has moved far beyond mere excavation, employing a suite of technologies that act like a time-traveling detective's toolkit. Satellite imagery and LiDAR scans, which can peer through dense forest canopies to map the ground beneath, are revealing a hidden landscape. They identify the ghostly outlines of roads, farms, and small fortifications previously invisible to the naked eye, showing us not just the grand capitals but the entire network of settlements that supported the empire. This allows researchers to see the collapse not as a single event in one city, but as a wave of abandonment sweeping across the Anatolian plateau. At the same time, scientists are turning to the bones of the Hittites themselves. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains can read the chemical signatures locked inside, telling a personal story of diet and movement. By studying the isotopes in tooth, enamel, and bones, researchers can determine if a person spent their life in one valley or migrated from afar, and whether their final years were marked by famine or a stable, grain-based diet. This data moves us beyond grand theories of empire and directly into the lives of the people who endured its fall. Were they starving? Were they on the move? The bones provide stark, individual answers. Groundbreaking excavations at sites like Oymogas Höyük in northern Turkey are adding thrilling new chapters to this story. This site, a suspected major Hittite cult center, has yielded its own archive of clay tablets. Each new fragment of text is a potential key, offering local perspectives from the empire's hinterlands that might contradict or complicate the official narrative from the capital. These finds challenge our old assumptions by reminding us that the Hittite experience was not monolithic. The empire's end may have played out differently in a remote religious center than it did in the political heart of Hattusa. The future of this investigation lies in even more advanced techniques. DNA studies on ancient remains, still in their early stages for this period, promise to trace population movements with unprecedented clarity. Were there significant new groups of people entering the region just before the collapse? Could they detect evidence of pandemic diseases in the genetic material? Furthermore, improved methods of deciphering the Luwian hieroglyphic script used on public monuments across the empire are slowly making more texts readable. A single phrase on a forgotten stele could reference a famine, a forgotten battle, or a dynastic struggle that provides the missing piece of the puzzle. Each of these technological advances acts like a new lens, bringing the blurred image of the past into sharper focus. They narrow the field of possible explanations, forcing historians to discard outdated ideas and refine their models of the collapse. Yet, for all this powerful science, the central mystery defiantly persists. This collaboration between the hard sciences and the humanities demonstrates that solving history's greatest puzzles requires both carbon dating and cultural understanding. The ongoing research fuels a palpable hope that a definitive breakthrough is waiting just beneath the surface. What final questions must we ask to find it? The silence of the Hittite collapse is broken not by answers but by a chorus of fiercely debated questions. Why, for instance, did they never return? Other empires, like the Egyptians or later the Romans, faced crises and rebuilt, but the Hittite imperial structure vanished forever. This suggests their collapse was uniquely total, shattering the very institutions and collective will needed for recovery. Another enigma is the precise timeline of their final days. Did a civil war spark a famine, or did a famine ignite the civil war? We lack the chronological resolution to say which domino fell first, making it impossible to distinguish cause from effect. Perhaps the most telling gap is the absence of a clear narrative in their own records. The Hittites were meticulous chroniclers, yet no tablet reads, "This is how our empire ended." The final messages are fragmented and desperate, speaking of grain shortages and enemy movements, but they provide no epilogue. This informational blackout implies a breakdown so rapid and chaotic that the scribbled tradition itself was extinguished before it could record its own demise. These voids in our knowledge fuel the central debate among historians. Was it a single, catastrophic event that delivered a killing blow? Or was it a slow, grinding decline over generations? The evidence from Hattusa showing a planned exodus argues for a gradual process, yet the widespread burning of frontier forts points to moments of sudden, violent crisis. This has led many experts to champion a multi-causal model. They argue that no single factor was sufficient on its own. Instead, a convergence of pressures, a perfect storm of drought, invasion, and internal rebellion, created a chain reaction where each problem amplified the others. A drought caused famine, which sparked rebellion, which weakened the army, which invited invasion, creating a feedback loop of collapse from which there was no escape. Opponents of this view still search for a primary trigger, a linchpin whose removal caused the entire system to fail, but the fragmented evidence refuses to yield one. This fundamental uncertainty is precisely what keeps the Hittite mystery so compelling across the centuries. It is a historical cold case with a surplus of motives and no clear culprit, inviting every new generation of scholars to sift through the clues anew. And by examining this ancient puzzle, we are forced to ask a much broader question about the nature of civilization itself. How does the fall of a Bronze Age superpower compare to the disappearance of other great societies? Lost to time, the mystery of the Hittites echoes across time and continents, finding strange reflections in other historical disappearances. Centuries after Hattusa fell silent, the great Maya cities of Central America were also abandoned to the jungle. Their towering pyramids and plazas were left empty, a puzzle of environmental strain, shifting trade routes, and likely internal conflict, much like the Hittite collapse. On a smaller but equally haunting scale, the English settlement at Roanoke vanished, leaving only a cryptic carving as a clue. In all these cases, a combination of pressures, from a changing climate to social fragmentation, appears to have overwhelmed a community, leaving behind a ghostly vacancy where a vibrant society once thrived. The contrast with the Roman Empire is stark. Rome's fall was a slow unraveling chronicled by countless historians, a story with clear political and military chapters. The Hittites, by comparison, left almost no narrative of their own demise. Their end is a shadow play, inferred from charred ruins and silent tablets, making its ultimate cause far more opaque. Placing these mysteries side by side reveals a sobering pattern. Complex societies, whether Bronze Age empires or classical civilizations, grapple with universal challenges. The management of essential resources like water and timber, the stability of political institutions, and the resilience of trade networks are common threads in the story of collapse. Yet each case is also uniquely shaped by its own geography and culture. The Hittites were uniquely vulnerable to drought in a way the river-fed Egyptians were not. The Maya faced tropical deforestation, issues distinct from those in Anatolia. This comparative view teaches us that while the ingredients for collapse may be similar, the final recipe is always different. It forces us to look beyond a single cause and appreciate the intricate, interconnected web of factors that can bring down a civilization. By studying the Hittites alongside the Maya and others, we begin to see the recurring pressure points in human societies, the shared vulnerabilities that echo through history. This broader lens does not solve the Hittite mystery, but it deepens our understanding of the fragile balance that defines any great civilization. It shows us that their story is not an isolated tragedy, but a powerful chapter in the long, complex study of how societies rise, adapt, and sometimes fall. And this ancient story, lost for millennia, continues to resonate in surprising ways within our modern world. The Hittites may be gone, but they are far from forgotten, their ghostly presence felt in the pages of best-selling novels and the digital landscapes of video games. They are often cast as the ultimate lost civilization, a blank slate onto which we project our own fears and fascinations. In popular fiction, their sudden disappearance is frequently explained by spectacular invasions, ancient curses laid upon their kings, or even encounters with otherworldly beings. These creative retellings, while entertaining, reveal a deep human desire to solve a mystery that cold, hard facts have so far failed to crack. They transform an archaeological puzzle into an epic narrative of doom. Alongside this fictional revival, a scholarly one has brought the real Hittites into the light. Major museums around the world now host permanent collections, and traveling exhibitions showcase their majestic stone lions, intricate gold seals, and the very clay tablets that recorded their laws. For the first time in millennia, the public can stand face to face with artifacts from this vanished empire, creating a tangible connection across the centuries. This cultural footprint is vital, as it sparks curiosity in young minds who might one day become the historians to finally decipher the empire's final days. Yet this popularity comes with a responsibility. The romanticized image of a cursed people can sometimes overshadow the nuanced human-scale tragedy of their collapse. The real story is not about magic or aliens, but about the fragile interplay of climate, economy, and governance, a story with profound relevance for our own complex world. The challenge is to embrace the wonder that keeps the Hittites in our imagination while firmly grounding our search in the evidence they left behind. This careful balance between storytelling and science leads us directly to a crucial and often overlooked dimension of their legacy, the ethical weight of unearthing a lost world. Unearthing a lost civilization is more than a scientific endeavor. It is a profound responsibility. The scattered bones and broken pottery of the Hattusans are not merely artifacts, they are the final remains of a people, demanding respectful treatment from those who would study them. This ethical duty extends from the physical to the political. The very narrative of the Hittite collapse can be a weapon, twisted to serve modern agendas. Nationalist groups might claim direct descent to legitimize territorial claims, while others could point to the empire's fall as a simplistic warning about societal decay, ignoring the complex multi-causal reality. Archaeologists must navigate this minefield, balancing the pursuit of knowledge with cultural sensitivity, especially when excavating in regions scarred by contemporary conflict, where ancient sites can become casualties of modern wars or targets for looters funding violence. The race against time is constant, as urban expansion and industrial farming threaten to pave over untouched layers of history forever. But perhaps the most significant ethical question the Hittites pose is about our own future. Their story is a stark lesson in societal fragility, a case study in how climate shifts, resource depletion, and political fragmentation can conspire to unravel a complex world. To study their collapse is not an academic exercise, it is a mirror held up to our own global challenges. It forces us to ask if we are listening to the whispers from the past and what our responsibility is to heed them. This reflection on vulnerability inevitably draws our attention back to the empire's very core, to the administrative system that once held everything together. The true power of the Hittite Empire resided not just in its army, but in the thousands of clay tablets that governed its daily life. At the heart of this system was a highly centralized bureaucracy, a complex machine of scribes, officials, and provincial governors all reporting back to the king in Hattusa. This intricate web of control was held together by binding treaties with vassal states, which swore loyalty and tribute in exchange for protection. For centuries, this structure was the empire's greatest strength, allowing for the efficient collection of taxes in the form of grain and metals, the coordination of massive building projects, and the rapid mustering of armies from across Anatolia. The system was designed to funnel power and resources to the center, creating a formidable, unified state. Yet this very strength contained the seeds of a fatal weakness. The entire empire was like a wheel with Hattusa as its only hub. If that hub were to crack, every spoke connected to it would fall. As long as the capital was strong and communications were swift, the system thrived. But what happened when the messages stopped getting through? The clay tablets themselves provide a clue. Alongside meticulous records of grain shipments and legal codes, we find increasingly frantic correspondence. A governor in a distant province pleads for military support against raiders. A vassal king delays his tribute, testing the limits of the emperor's authority. These were the early warning signs of a system under stress. In normal times, a strong king could dispatch an army to enforce his will. But during a prolonged crisis like the Great Drought, this rigidity became a death sentence. A provincial governor facing famine might have needed the flexibility to use his grain reserves to feed his own people, but the central bureaucracy in Hattusa, desperate to feed itself, would have demanded that same grain be sent to the capital. This conflict between local survival and imperial command could easily have sparked rebellion. The system, so brilliant at managing a stable empire, was utterly incapable of adapting to a world of simultaneous, cascading emergencies. Corruption and inefficiency, always lurking in any large administration, would have flourished in this atmosphere of desperation, further paralyzing the state's ability to respond. The collapse of Hittite administration was not a single event, but a slow-motion unraveling of trust and obligation. This failure of governance offers a timeless lesson about the fragility of top-down control. But how did the empire see itself in its final days? Its own art and iconography provide a silent, yet powerful testimony to its changing world. The stone lions guarding Hattusa's gates stare out with a timeless, defiant power. This art was never merely decorative, it was a language carved in rock, a deliberate projection of imperial identity. On cliff faces and temple walls, Hittite artists depicted their kings standing tall before a pantheon of gods, receiving the symbols of rulership in a sacred compact. These scenes were political propaganda in its purest form, designed to show a stable, divinely sanctioned order. Yet in the empire's final century, this visual language begins to shift in subtle but telling ways. The confident, serene faces of earlier monarchs give way to figures portrayed in more dynamic, often militaristic poses. A king is shown not just receiving power, but actively wielding a weapon, his chariot charging into battle. This shift could signal a society that feels under siege, where the ruler's primary role is no longer priestly mediator but war leader. The art becomes less about cosmic order and more about raw, earthly survival. Even the grand processions of gods and goddesses, once central to temple reliefs, sometimes show influences from neighboring Syria or Mesopotamia, as if the Hittites were absorbing outside cultural elements, perhaps in an attempt to forge new alliances or appease new populations. Interpreting these changes is like reading a book with half the pages torn out. Does a more aggressive royal image mean the empire was actually fighting more wars, or was it a desperate attempt to project strength in the face of growing internal weakness? A single sculpture cannot tell us if the king was powerful, only that he wanted to be seen as powerful. This is the fundamental challenge of using art as evidence. Without the full context, we risk projecting our own assumptions onto these silent stones. Yet when we place these shifting artistic themes alongside the textual evidence of famine and rebellion, a more coherent and tragic picture emerges. The empire's carefully crafted image of eternal stability was cracking, both on the walls of its temples and in the foundations of its state. This visual record adds a poignant human layer to the collapse, showing a civilization struggling to maintain its own story in the face of unimaginable pressures. But if the art hints at a world coming apart, could the very ground beneath their feet have been the final, violent actor in this drama? The ground beneath the Hittites was as unreliable as their political alliances. Anatolia rests on a web of active fault lines, a land constantly shifting and settling. Geological evidence points to significant seismic activity during the empire's final century, powerful earthquakes that would have shaken the very foundations of Hattusa. Imagine the terror of a tremor striking the capital, toppling sections of its monumental walls, collapsing granaries full of precious food, and crushing homes under tons of stone. Such a disaster would have been catastrophic on its own, but for an empire already reeling from drought and rebellion, it was a multiplier of misery. The state's ability to organize relief and rebuild would have been severely tested, draining its dwindling resources and further exposing its weakening authority. If the gods could send earthquakes, then the king had clearly lost their favor. Beyond the immediate tremors, a more distant threat may have cast a long shadow. While no specific volcano has been definitively linked to the Hittite collapse, a major eruption somewhere on the planet could have ejected vast amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a volcanic winter. This phenomenon would have lowered global temperatures for years, leading to shortened growing seasons and failed harvests. For a civilization already battling a 300-year drought, an additional climatic shock of this magnitude could have been the final, suffocating blow. The search for proof is etched in the earth itself. Scientists analyze ice cores from Greenland and lake sediments in Turkey, looking for telltale layers of volcanic ash that can be precisely dated. The challenge is to correlate these geological fingerprints with the specific years of the Hittite collapse, a task that so far has yielded no definitive culprit. This natural hazard angle is a humbling reminder of the raw, physical forces that ancient societies faced. A single night of violent tremors could have shattered the remaining confidence in a state that could no longer protect its people from the wrath of the earth or the sky. Yet, even as their own land betrayed them, the Hittites were also victims of a different kind of fragility, one woven into the very trade routes that had once made them rich. The grand palaces of Hattusa were built on a foundation of distant mines and foreign looms. For all its military might, the Hittite Empire lived or died by the flow of international trade. Its most critical import was tin, a metal so vital it was the Bronze Age equivalent of oil, shipped all the way from the mountains of Afghanistan. Without this tin, smelted with Cypriot copper, the empire could not produce the bronze for its weapons, tools, or ceremonial goods. But the reliance did not stop there. Fine textiles from Mesopotamia, luxury oils, and even prized horses were brought in through a delicate web of diplomatic and commercial exchange. This was not merely about luxury, it was about survival. The entire economic engine was fueled by goods that the Hittite heartland simply could not produce. To secure these lifelines, the Hittite kings became masters of international diplomacy. They forged alliances through carefully arranged marriages, sending Hittite princesses to foreign courts to cement bonds of loyalty and commerce. The most famous of these agreements was the peace treaty with Egypt, which not only ended hostilities but also promised mutual aid and, crucially, the safe passage of merchants. The famous Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence, reveal the intricate dance of these relationships. Kings addressed each other as brothers, exchanging lavish gifts and making thinly veiled demands for gold, all while negotiating the complex politics of the ancient Near East. Yet these letters also hint at underlying tensions. A delayed shipment of promised goods could be interpreted as a grave insult. A rumor of a rival alliance could shatter years of careful trust. The entire system was a high-wire act of prestige and pragmatism. So what happened when this intricate network began to fail? If Egypt, reeling from its own crises, could no longer guarantee safe passage for ships, or if the source of tin in Afghanistan was cut off by migrating tribes, the effect on the Hittites would have been immediate and catastrophic. Their forges would fall silent. The elite who demonstrated their status through imported finery would lose their symbolic power, but the damage would run deeper than material shortage. A breakdown in trade was also a breakdown in communication. The merchant ships and diplomatic couriers were the internet of the ancient world, carrying not just goods, but vital information about troop movements, political unrest, and potential threats. Without them, the Hittite court in its Anatolian highland would have been deaf and blind, isolated from the very intelligence it needed to navigate a world in turmoil. This ancient form of globalization created profound vulnerabilities. The empire's strength was inextricably linked to the stability of its partners, and when those partners began to falter during the wider Bronze Age collapse, the Hittites were pulled down with them. Their story demonstrates a timeless truth that no civilization is an island. The intricate tapestry of the Hittite collapse was woven from many threads. No single theory, whether invasion, drought, or rebellion, can fully explain the silence that followed their reign. It was the convergence of all these pressures that proved unstoppable. A prolonged drought crippled their agriculture, leading to famine and social unrest. This internal weakness was exploited by rebellious vassals and opportunistic raiders, straining a military already suffering from severed supply lines for bronze and iron. The resulting civil wars fractured political unity at the very moment the central government needed to be strongest. Meanwhile, the collapse of international trade partners left the economy in shambles and the empire isolated. Each crisis amplified the next, creating a feedback loop of failure. The Hittite Empire did not fall to a single enemy, but was gradually suffocated by a perfect storm of environmental, economic, and political disasters. Its demise stands as a powerful lesson in the fragility of complex societies, a reminder that the greatest threats often come not from one direction, but from all sides at once. This perfect storm of crises reveals a devastating chain reaction. The initial spark was likely environmental, a brutal drought that parched the farmlands for years. This was not a single bad season, but a slow, suffocating disaster that emptied the state granaries and left the population hungry and desperate. A malnourished people is a discontented people, and this social unrest would have frayed the loyalty of the provinces, sparking rebellions against a central government that could no longer provide food. A kingdom fighting itself is a kingdom with its back turned. This internal weakness created an open invitation for external raiders. Groups like the Sea Peoples, whether invaders or desperate migrants themselves, found an empire whose defenses were stretched thin and whose army was distracted by civil strife. They could raid coastlines and sever trade routes with impunity, choking off the vital flow of metals and goods. At the very moment the empire needed strong, decisive leadership to coordinate a response, it was crippled by its own political structure. Dynastic squabbles and succession crises meant that rival princes were fighting each other instead of uniting against the common threat. The highly centralized bureaucracy, once a source of strength, became a fatal bottleneck, unable to adapt to the cascading emergencies. This is why the collapse was not a sudden explosion, but a gradual dimming. Cities were not all destroyed in a single war. They were systematically abandoned as the systems that sustained them failed one by one. The people of Hattusa did not flee a conquering army at their gates. They left because the city could no longer feed them, protect them, or offer them a future. No single one of these factors could have toppled the Hittite Empire on its own. A drought alone they might have weathered, an invasion alone their army could have repelled. But the convergence of all these pressures at once created a trap from which there was no escape. Each problem amplified the others, creating a feedback loop of collapse. While this multi-causal model brings us closer than ever to understanding their fate, the silence of the archives ensures that absolute certainty remains just out of reach. The mystery endures not for a lack of clues, but because the clues point in so many directions at once. and so we are left to ponder what this ancient catastrophe can teach us about our own world. The collapse of the Hittite Empire stands as a timeless testament to the fragility of human achievement. We have sifted through the evidence from silent droughts to phantom invaders and found not one villain but a chorus of them. Each theory provides a piece of the puzzle, yet the full picture of their demise remains frustratingly out of focus, a permanent question mark etched into the landscape of history. This enduring mystery does more than captivate scholars. It holds up a distant mirror to our own world. The Hittites' struggle with environmental shifts, economic interdependence, and political instability echoes the complex challenges we face today, reminding us that the lessons of resilience and sustainability are as urgent now as they were 3,000 years ago. The story is not finished. With every satellite image analyzed and every new tablet translated, our understanding deepens, ensuring the legacy of the Hittites will continue to evolve and inspire. Thank you for exploring this ancient enigma, a civilization lost and found. If this journey into the past resonated with you, please subscribe for more and share your own theories in the comments below.